Hey there. So AOS 3 launched over the weekend, and by now this is ancient history in the life cycle of the internet. But hey, this is my third time recording due to some audio issues, and let's just have a good time and rate some Stormcasts based on how good they look. By the way, that is, the main thing that they did preview over the weekend. Whatever box we get is going to have this whole new set of Thunderstrike Stormcast, which is cool. It's a sort of maybe the fourth paradigm of Stormcast looks that we've got. So I just wanted to, go through all of them. They've sort of established the same kind of structure for each time, where it's, you'll get some basic Stormcasts, some shooters too, that are kind of designed the same way. And then you get some fancy ones like the paladins and foot characters, and then some mounted ones, and then, there's almost always a centerpiece. The Vanguard didn't get one, but, too bad for them. So I do want to just go over, the looks and the history of Stormcast in terms of aesthetics. But to do that, I just want to talk about, what is even the point of Stormcasts in the hobby? They, launched somewhat controversially. A lot of that was folks angry that the end times were, getting got as far as removing the old world. And so I think a lot of people took their frustrations out on Stormcast, but they've still kind of kept the Sigmarines moniker, even among people who, really love AOS otherwise. So let's talk about what their purpose is in the game and, why GW needed to add them. Because I do think that they serve a really important purpose as far as the, poster boys of a game having different requirements than most of the other factions do. When you look at what Space Marines do for 40k, they provide an easy face for the game where it's just obvious exactly what's going on as soon as you look at them. And they're also kind of rewarding to deep dive, right? There's a whole bunch of background lore on them, a lot of sort of different things to dig into. And so I think Stormcast really need to be able to do that for the fantasy version as well, right? You need to be able to show someone new what exactly they're getting into with Stormcast, and they need to be able to grok it right away. And then, that's not that every new player, every young player wants that in their faction, but it does just get more important with new and young players. And so then you also need them to have enough to dig in there with, actual pathos in terms of their story that you just feel happy continuing to paint them, into your adult years. I do want to talk about the power fantasy with them. That word is usually used derisively to refer to, people who are into escapist genre fiction. And, some of those criticisms are real, but I think it's also overblown a lot because there's nothing wrong with people wanting to feel sort of special and inspired by their miniatures. And so ideally, that's what Stormcast are providing, right? Where you can be painting a Stormcast and you should be able to hold it in your hand and feel like this is some fantasy version of you, something that you can relate to, right? Space Marines are excellent at that. I have a lot of problems with 40k and some of the, fascist apologia that happens in that game, especially with Space Marines. But at the very core of what they're achieving, it's really easy to hold a Space Marine in your hand and be like, man, I want to have like superpowers and tromp around the galaxy going on adventures, right? I think Stormcast really need to be able to capture that. And then they also just need to be easy to paint. The ideal Stormcast is something that, is really easy for a new player to paint, but then also gives you a lot to work with as you get better. And so, you want to be able to do the non-metallic metal or things like that without having just really annoying sort of details to pick up on that, might be more appropriate for a dirty elf player or something. So let's get into the new releases and the history of Stormcast aesthetics to, talk about how well they do with those kinds of goals. And the thing I'm really excited about to talk about first is the new angel that they previewed this weekend. Yndrasta, I think she's called. And I think she just does a great job at being this sort of new introduction point because you take a look at her and you immediately know what's going on, right? With this kind of armored look, this angel situation. It looks a lot like something that's, could easily be a magic card. Some people, of course, bristle when you talk about, sort of the most popular, genre game in the tabletop space, but they've had a ton of success putting angels into the game, and just new players immediately see the sort of majestic angel, battle angels on the cards and just immediately grok what's going on. And I think that's going to be perfect here. It's a little bit more sort of relatable in that way than the Celestin Prime was. The Celestin Prime having his sort of weird ribbon. Sorry, the ribbons are odd to me. And then, the wings made out of spikes don't quite sort of communicate quite as quickly as just wings made out of wings do. And then I think that those are also a great choice for new players painting. One thing that's really cool about feathered wings is that if you just dry brush them twice, right, they can look really good, but the best way to paint them, right, is sort of painstakingly putting striations into the feathers and then glazing over that. And you can create really incredible effects that way. You can go for really naturalistic feathers if that's what you want to do, right? You could sort of bring up a reference photo of a hawk and try to make the wings match that hawk if you get really intense. So you could take this model and you could go, I'm going to paint all non-metallic metal, and then I'm going to make the wings look like an actual bird's wings. And a master painter is going to create an incredible miniature doing that. But a newish painter can absolutely just like paint the armor gold, dry brush it silver, then paint, the wings white, off-white, dry brush them white, and then put just a really thinned down blue glaze over them and kind of get to a pretty good looking point with that. I think that's really important, and I also love how the lines go on this miniature where, the wings and the weapons both kind of working in parallel here to kind of draw your eye always straight up to, the face of the model and the sort of back crown that's happening right behind them. I think that works really well. I love how some of the details, like the little hawk knee pad, work out. Just a really great sculpt, and I think it's going to be a really great centerpiece. I don't know if it's going to come in the starter box or not, but either way, I think it's a really great iteration. Not that the Celestin Prime is bad. I do think the Celestin Prime succeeds on a number of the levels where this is succeeding, but it just, it gets that extra another step, and I think it succeeds even better than the Celestin Prime does. So let's talk about, speaking of the Celestin Prime, let's talk about kind of the early days of Stormcast, right? And the prettiness that we got there. Liberators, of course, launched with the game. And the first thing, when you hold a Liberator, they are really chunky, which is nice for painting. They dwarf the Primaris Space Marines that I have, all the Stormcast do in general. And so they were really loved, they sold a lot. They've sold a ton of Space Marines, or sorry, they've also sold a ton of Space Marines, but they sold a ton of Stormcast, even though Stormcast are pretty hated online. And so my theory for this is that, Liberators, they are really easy to paint. They take a bunch of different color combinations really well. Like you can see here, the Celestial Vindicator scheme, the black scheme, works pretty well. Lots of, the trim is sort of bright and clear, but it's not too hard to put together. The problem is, I do think there's a bit of a lack of personality with those sculpts, and I think that's why just a lot of people, got really made fun of them, calling them Sigmarines right away, right? Is that there's not quite so much there when you sort of look into this, who even are these Liberators? They don't feel that different from each other. It's hard to say sort of what they're into, what they're about, and I think that was sort of generally fumbled with the launch of Stormcast Eternals. So then, their first attempt to rectify that was with Vanguard, and they're definitely aware, right, of some of the stuff, right? So they've put these sort of furs on there. I think fur is a great sort of option for being not too hard to paint. It's not that easy either, but sort of dry brushing and washing can get you most of the way there. These are my Tempest Lord Vanguard over here in the top right. The only issue I have is they still have the same chunkiness that Liberators do, which is a bit at odds with their kind of woodsman hunter situation that they're going for, right? So you look at these Vanguard hunters, they're not really sneaking through the woods, right? No matter how you paint them, especially if you paint them gold, they're definitely not sneaking up on anybody in the woods, which I don't think totally works for me. Now, I don't know if the popularity issues that the Vanguard Marines had was due to, you know, that kind of aesthetic mismatch, or if it was just due to the fact that they never got very good rules in game, right? That whole release, other than the Vanguard Raptors, kind of struggled with that. So it's tough to say sort of chicken or the egg there, what was the problem, but either way, these weren't the best. I also will get more into my frustration with bolters, with bolter crossbows later, but I do think these kind of pistol bolters, they don't really work for me as far as sort of a fantasy game. I know that they're trying to sort of capture what's good about Space Marines, but I think this was sort of learning the wrong lessons from the Space Marine success and applying it to Stormcast Eternals. Luckily, their kind of later iterations have been a lot better, and sort of getting into the previews from this weekend too. So first I'll talk about Sequitors, which as base models are, good and bad. So the warrior monk aesthetic, I think, it got generally great reviews when it came out, and I kind of agree with that. I think they look amazing. I think there's a really clear vision of who these people are and what they're setting out to achieve. When you sort of put them all together, they have a lot of character in that way. The lore, lore needs to work both when you read the books and really dig into it, and when you just like see a couple materials with just a couple words out there, just like posters, right? You need to be able to grok the lore from the posters, and the Sequitors do that. They manage to say like, well, these are the kind of wizardy stormcasts that deal with souls, and it's pretty clear right away, and I think that that's a really strong direction for them to have taken when the Soul Wars launched. The only issue is that they're awful to paint for a new player. The Soul Wars box was the second thing I ever purchased for Warhammer, after I start collecting for Seraphon. And so I'm the proud owner of just some awfully painted Sequitors, just because they're brutal on new players. The robes are not friendly at all. There's a lot of details that are kind of on top of the robes. Like if you look at these, they have like studded hems on their robes, which is just awful for picking out, especially because you're usually trying to do it with a metallic paint, which doesn't really work with detail quite as well. Especially the same with these sort of necklaces and things on top of the robes. Just really easy to ruin a good paint job with Sequitors if you don't know what you're doing. And so I think that really, it's a shame, right? Because I think that they fixed the personality issue that Stormcast had with this release, but they did it at the cost of completely ruining the sort of easy to paint for new players situation that is so important. The other thing that Sequitors, they actually did start to fix with Sequitors is, I complain a little bit about pauldrons with GW in general. The whole game is basically just pauldrons. But one thing that worked well with Sequitors is, so they brought the first sort of rank and file female models into the Stormcast range, and they got great reviews at the time. I think they hold up really well. And one thing about them that I think makes it work so well is that the female Sequitors have much more reasonable sized pauldrons, right? If you look here, if you look at the two female black ones, the purple one here, the pauldrons are just much more subtle on the female models, and I think it looks great. And I'm really glad that they learned that lesson for the whole release for Vindicators. Vindicators have much more subtle pauldrons. The curve actually goes with the shoulder, right? So the purpose of these pauldrons in general, right, is to make the figure look more imposing, which sort of plays into the power fantasy of sort of superhuman thunder warriors. And so these pauldrons do succeed at doing that, right? They're much more imposing than they would be otherwise, but they at least look like they can move. They look like they can actually wield these weapons. Look at how dynamic these spear poses are, right? I think that really helps them, and it helps give them personality to it. I think it makes them more relatable. Um, you know, the fact that their proportions are a little bit more recognizable, I think helps there. Um, you know, a lot of people have talked about sort of Greek hoplites with kind of them reminding them of that with this release. I think that that's a really good choice for them. And then just the more subtle sort of crowns, right? The starburst crown that can be just way too loud on some of the other releases. Like if you look at the Vanguard, I went for as many sort of helmetless options as I could, just because I think that the Vanguard sort of top of the head being like an entire animal plus a starburst, plus a little tassel, it just doesn't make any sense at all. So they've gone way more subtle with that. It looks like only the leader is going to have the tassel, which I think makes a lot of sense. I think that that's really great. I think just in general, the more reserved approach is really important, but also they've kept what was, the one thing that's good about Liberators being that you can paint them, you can obsess over the most quality paint job you can grab with them, or you can paint them really easily by just, spraying them silver, tossing some contrast over that, and then, you have your colored metallic, and it's going to work. It's going to be fine. Let's also talk about, the shooters, right? So they always mirror the current base troop. Let me know what you would wish for the new Thunderstrike shooters. Personally, I'm hoping for another return to closer to the Judicator aesthetic, specifically with bows. I think that the bows looked really natural. The Vanguard Raptors worked too, partly because they have the tripod for their crossbows, which just makes them much more easy to wield. It makes these giant sort of sniper rifle type crossbows just make a ton more sense. I've never really liked the crossbow aesthetic with any of the other releases, right? Castigators and Judicators with crossbows. This is totally a personal thing. Let me know if you disagree in the comments, but I just think it looks awful in terms of copying the bolter aesthetic, just because, bolters, for the most part, Space Marines have actually pretty reasonable guns for their size, right? And then reloading is just putting a clip in the bottom. It's not like, say, for Castigators, where you have to take this sort of magic grenade and actually load it like a blunderbuss into the front of the thing, right? And these are just too bulky, right? You could never do this reasonably in a fight. Like, in any kind of fight, unless you're sort of really well protected and you're just sitting there, I mean, it's still going to take you like 20 minutes to load that thing, and it's just too bulky for them, right? So think about, like, if you're holding a bunch of beach balls, right? I can only hold maybe 2 beach balls. The third one is just random luck whether it stays there. Even though weight-wise, it's not a problem for me at all, obviously, right? Like, when you, say in superhero movies and TV shows, when they show the hero picking up a bus, it's just not practical. Like, even if you were super strong, you can't pick up a bus because the structural integrity of it, the bulkiness of it, it just wouldn't work. So even if a bus was only 10 pounds and you could try to pick up the whole thing, it'd be impossible, right? A superhero would be ripping pieces of the bus off trying to pick it up because there's just no stable person or stable place on the bus where something with human-sized hands could actually pick it up. And I think they have that problem with crossbows in all of their shooter releases. So I'm really hoping these new Thunderstrikes come with some sort of bow option when they go for the ranged troops, which have generally been sort of how they've approached Stormcast competitively, is giving them ranged. I do hope that there are melee options for competitive Stormcast, but we'll see how that goes. Next is sort of the fancy part that always comes with every Stormcast release. And there's some really interesting things to sort of talk about when you look at all of them together. The first is, obviously, they always go for a lot more detail. And I think it's important to talk about whether it's dry brushable detail or sort of pick out detail. And when I say dry brushable detail, I mean things like this, these sort of textured armors, things like this lion chest plate that they do for this new Annihilator, I think are really excellent because, again, an expert painter can, with highlights and with just like very sort of detailed shading, can make something really incredible with that. But a newer painter can still have at it, right? You could say, again, spray paint this whole thing silver, slap a contrast over it, dry brush with like a whitish silver, which there are a few of those out there, and then slap a different contrast over it. And you'll have this incredible miniature where you didn't do anything the whole time that required really any skill. Not that dry brushing takes no skill, but it's just a much more new painter-friendly technique. And then you'll have this sort of multi-hued, highly contrasting, just incredible looking miniature with just, really low effort there. And then you can just focus on, what color do you want the pauldron to be, or how do you want to paint the weapon? And it can be really easy to paint a whole bunch of them for a newer player. Whereas, if you look at these evocators, that's just not going to happen. Even just sequitors, that whole release in general, right? That's just not going to happen. And the same is true for this Lord Castellan. Now, I do think for characters, for the Fancy Stormcast, it's much more excusable to have, a greater level of detail. But the entire first range, the characters are just ridiculous, right? These ribbons that come right next to the armor, they kind of stop you from being able to just dry brush the armor easily unless you want to start all over on the ribbons. The ribbons are very dry brushable, when they're not right on top of armor, but doing them here is difficult. It's hard to do this in a way that sort of creates a good amount of contrast on the model. I would even argue that in this particular paint job, they failed at that assignment. So if the heavy metal team is struggling, then, I'm not going to manage it. And then, Neve Blacktalon, who I think generally is a great sculpt, looks great, but she has a bolter that's hidden by her cloak. So if you're a new player, you're not just going to know about sub-assemblies, right? You're going to have to go on the internet or something, or, you're going to have to be talking to people who are experts in this about what to do to actually find out about, like, oh, it's actually generally a bad idea to put something together exactly how the instructions tell you to. So then you're just going to have a hell of a time trying to get to that bolter or even get to the cloak while it's there. The other thing that I think that all the fancy ones need to provide is sort of silhouette variety, right? So I have a bunch of evocators that, are next to my sequitors, and they don't really stand out much. They don't look like they're more special than the sequitors do. They look like they're just kind of another variety of the same thing. Annihilators are not going to have that problem, right? So if you look at this Annihilator, I mean, he's just the most solid, absolute unit, a barn door of a man. And so when you put him next to these kind of slender, almost agile looking Vindicators, he's going to really stand out, right? So I think that that's an awesome sort of contrast that they've had. I'm really excited to see what that looks like on the tabletop when you have squads of them sort of together at last. The other thing that you sort of flashing back to those Vindicators reminds me of is, look how much, they've taken subtlety to mean kind of everything here. It's really the name of the game. Whereas some of these, when they started putting female sculpts into Stormcast, there was quite a bit of controversy on, what I would call boob plate, right? That's what most people on the internet call it. There's a lot of different resources you can go to arguing over, whether or not that's makes sense as armor. I won't sort of weigh in too much on that, but I will say that it's clear where GW comes in on it because they've kept it but made it much more subtle. And I think that that's the right choice. I think that that's a great choice by them. And, it shows they are committed to saying, very clearly that we want to not only show that female warriors are welcome in our poster boy faction, but also sort of code them that way, not do sort of the Chaos Warrior thing where they say, listen, we have female Chaos Warriors, they just wear the exact same armor. I do think that that's also a perfectly valid choice. It works great for Chaos Warriors, but I think, how you code something does matter for representation, right? You can say all orcs are genderless, but the fact that they're all coded the way society currently codes male does read a certain way, right? On a totally unrelated note, one thing that I did notice about these Vindicators is they're a bit top-heavy in general. They seem to have skipped leg day, not calf day, right? They do their calf raises quite a bit. You can see they really work on those, but it seems to be all push-ups and calf raises. They don't do any squats. They've got pretty thin thighs here. So, I bet they have low movement despite their lighter armor just because, you got to have squats to run fast. All right, so let's get into the mounts, because I think that they've done a really good job with the mounts lately, and I'm really excited to see what we get for Thunderstrike Cavalry, right? So when they first started with the mounts, they had these Dracoths. I think the concept of a Dracoth is really cool, but the actual riders that they created, they're just very squat, very static, and, they don't have the dynamism that they sort of later added in. Right, because when you look at a Griff Charger, it looks like it could run 100 miles an hour. I mean, there's just so much dynamism in this pose, and it really makes the Vanguards it communicates what Vanguards are about so much better than the base models do, right? I mentioned before how the base models, there's no way you'd see them creeping through a forest, and obviously the mounts are even bigger, so you would think that that would be even less realistic to get through a forest, but you could absolutely see them, flying down a forest path because there's just so much sort of swiftness and agility that's communicated just by the Griff Charger. So I think it makes Paladors look like sort of this light skirmishing cavalry that's just lightning fast around the battlefield in a way that the base models just don't communicate that. And then Thundercats, I think, just kept that going, right? It stays right up to 11, where there's just so much power that's sort of implied by the poses that the Thundercats are in. I really love that. I think they fix all of my issues that I had, that I mentioned with Evocators. Evocators do look special and impressive when they're mounted on top of Thundercats. I think it's really good. I can't wait to see what they come up with for Thunderstrike Armored Stormcasts and what their cavalry would be. I'd love to see, maybe they could give the Dracoth treatment, or the Dracoths, which, just have these kind of stumpy static models. Maybe they could give them the more dynamic treatment, right? Say that when there's kind of a lighter, more jockey-like rider on top of them and maybe lighter armor, they can actually really get moving. I think that'd be really sweet. Or, they love making up totally new mounts, so I'd love to see what they do there too. Finally, I hope that they stick with just the Angel for the giant centerpiece, but, they have tried their hand at giant mounts too. If I had to choose between these two, I'd easily take the Star Drake each time. I think the poor Taurolon is one of the ugliest centerpiece models in my opinion. Listen, it's got these outstretched wings. The wings are outstretched because that animal couldn't fold up those wings even if it wanted to because of where that rider is on its back, right? Look, this rider is bigger than the mount is in some ways, right? Taurolons are much bigger than Dracolines, but as far as actually flying with that guy on his back, I don't know how that's possible. The Star Drake does not have this problem, right? It kind of looks like it would from here, but when you actually spin it around, the Star Drake is massive compared to the rider, and it's just a really impressive sculpt. If they do go for a mounted unit, I hope it's something sort of more majestic like that. I don't think the Taurolon worked at all, and I think that they know that too. Alright, so I've ranted on Stormcast aesthetics long enough, I think. I'm really curious to hear in the comments what you guys think. Let me know if this new release kind of fixes, let's say, your criticisms about feeling like Stormcasts are just Sigmarines, or if kind of it gives them more personality. I think they've done a really good job just in general of working with what was strong about the original Stormcast release, the Warrior Chamber, while sort of responding to some of the issues with it that they, fixed with the later chambers, but with mixed results. I think that they've kind of split the difference really, really well here, and I'm really excited to see what they come up with for, ranged and mounted units, because there's no way that this new box set only has what we've seen here. So we'll see what they show us. For my next few videos, I'll be returning to the more sort of Warcry focused type of thing, but it was a fun time, even though it took me 3 tries to actually get a recording done for for this video. It was a fun time going into the more aesthetic parts of the hobby. Let me know what you think about that, and until those next more tactical Warcry videos come out, may all your rolls be crits.